Welcome to Chillers and Thrillers Extra, paranormal stories that I include just for my YouTube subscribers. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you for joining, and let's get started. The French Encounter, submitted by user The Lace Snail. I studied abroad in France while I was in college years ago. Not far from my apartment was a public square that had once been the site of the city's first Christian church. The church had long crumbled away, but there is still a weathered stone cross in the square that served as a handy meeting place for friends in a time when cell phones were still rare. My sister and I were walking home from a movie and happened to encounter a couple of other American friends in the square, so we had stopped by the cross to chat with them in English. As we chatted, we were approached by a dark-haired young man who none of us knew. I say approached, although neither my sister nor myself actually remembers him approaching us. He was just kind of there. He spoke excellent English, but it was clear from his accent that English was not his first language. His accent wasn't necessarily French. We couldn't really attribute it to anywhere. He seemed polite and genuinely interested in conversation and gave no creepy, hitting on you vibes whatsoever. Curious, I asked him where he was from. "Oh, here. I've always been here," was his response. Then he kind of looks around, takes stock of where we were standing, and says, "I remember when this used to be a church." My hair was instantly on end. Our friends had moved on by this point, so I decided it was time to excuse ourselves and continue home. As we turned to leave, the young man asked us, "May I join you? May I come with you to your house?" He was really specific and insistent about receiving an invitation to my house, and all I could think about was that a vampire cannot enter your home without an invitation. We never saw him again, but we still talk about the night we met a vampire. The Disapearing Crowd, submitted by Reddit user Antagonizers. When I first met my wife 22 years ago, we would do a lot of urban exploring together. Finding old abandoned locations and taking pictures was one of the main things we had in common, so it made for the perfect date night. Anyway, one time we planned on visiting an old abandoned factory near the shore of Lake Ontario in Toronto. It was our first time going there, so we decided to head out just as the sun was coming up. This factory was set off of a beach where we decided would be a good place to park our car. As we get to the beach, we see at least 24 people standing on the shore, just staring out at the water and watching the sun. All different ages and all standing alone, as in no couples or families. We didn't think much of it until I realized that our car was the only one in the lot. There were no bikes, skateboards, or any other method of transportation either. This beach wasn't in a populated area, and even though it was plausible that they walked there, it seemed pretty unlikely. They could have taken a bus there, I suppose, but it was pretty early and the sun was just coming up. Anyway, as we pull in, every single one of them turns to look at us. They're all just staring our way, which made us a bit uncomfortable, of course. We actually discussed leaving. It creeped us out so much. In the end, we didn't see anything threatening, so we decided to keep going with our mission. So we walked up the beach to the fence line that led to this factory. All the while, these people are still staring at us as we climb through a hole in the fence. Once we did, I turned around to see that, once again, they were ignoring us and staring out at the water, like we weren't even there. So we're walking around this old factory, taking pictures and exploring, and after about 20 or 30 minutes or so, we decided to go get some breakfast. We climbed through the fence, and every single one of the people we saw were gone. Not a single person in sight, and it was incredibly quiet. No birds, nothing. More than that, the sand didn't look like it had been disturbed. There were ripples from the wind, but it absolutely did not look walked on. That creeped us out even worse, so we packed up and quickly left. The Hawaiian Bus Ride, submitted by user Olive U. Oliver from Jezebel.com. The women in my family are a mixed bag of crazy. We see, hear, sense, and dream odd things. So trying to write about one really scary story is very hard because every house I lived in was either haunted or became haunted due to the presence of my mother and I. This story is 100% true, hint Bible. I live in Oahu, Hawaii. Oahu is beautiful, but riddled with spiritual activity, so I expected daily occurrence of weirdness. My daily routine was simple: bus, Starbucks, work, bus, and then home. Like clockwork. Like clockwork on this day, I departed on the bus at 6:17 a.m. The bus's populace that early morning was rather crowded, so I sat in one of the seats closest to the rear exit. Thankfully, the numbers thinned out little by little. Normally on the bus here in Hawaii, an occasional homeless person would trudge onto the bus and stay glued to the handicapped section. The homeless man du jour was about 50 years old with a torn aloha shirt and once white Bermuda shorts. The homeless man began mumbling a string of random, incoherent sentences at every other stop. As the bus passed the Kokokahi YMCA, I looked at the homeless man because his mumbling speed and volume had increased to a steady talking. I faintly heard his talking through my earbuds. His words flew out at a breakneck pace, causing me to take off an earbud and try to eavesdrop more closely on his recitation. I was so curious about this man that I didn't bother to notice another man in a suit sitting right next to him. It was weird that I had just noticed the man in the suit, because I normally try to be observant on my bus rides due to the possibility of a stranger following me off the bus. Call it paranoia or being really cautious. But this man in the suit was of a slight build with a black suit, who looked comically out of place sitting next to a middle-aged homeless man. I kept my head somewhat down and my vision on my phone, trying to keep a low profile and not ogle, or at least not be noticed. The homeless guy isn't mumbling anymore by this point in the bus ride and is coherently speaking gibberish. His consistent pace of non-associated words are almost rhythmic. But it got horrifying when the man in the black suit looked like he was actively listening in on the homeless man's word. The man in the suit started to nod his head as if he was listening to an old friend. Then, clearly amidst the frantic story of words of the homeless man, I heard, "She can see us. She can see us." My blood ran cold, and I looked around for other people on the bus to see if they noticed what I was just witnessing. No one else was on the bus except myself, the homeless man, the bus driver, and the man in the black suit. Let it be known, I am a Catholic. A Jack Catholic, but a Catholic nonetheless. I have heard horror stories about spirit boards and demons, but I honestly wasn't prepared for what came next. The man in the suit stopped his even-paced nodding and listening to the homeless man, and looked straight at me. His eyes were pitch black, like the black sclera Halloween contacts. His thin and narrow face twisted into a grin. The homeless man immediately went quiet. What happened in those couple of seconds felt like forever. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shock ran up my spine. My limbs felt heavy, and I felt horribly nauseated. Then, I heard the man in the black suit say to me in a dry voice, "Yes, you can. Special, special girl." I felt like my heart was going to flip up into my throat. I heard a high-pitched ringing in my ears until I heard a voice ring out loud in my head. "Pray, pray hard, pray for the love of God." My vision started to blur as I saw the man in the suit sitting in a closer seat. I started to pray. My limbs started to feel lighter and lighter. I pulled the stop cable to signal the bus driver as tears were streaming down my face. I was a mile away from my work, but I didn't care. I was a cornered animal and I needed out. I shoved the doors open and got off the bus. The bus drove away, and I immediately threw up on the side of the road. I called my mom and cried, "Mom, demons are real. It's all real." The Woman in the Movie Theaters. Submitted by user Mr. Clarence Worley. This was back when I was in high school. We had a half-day schedule that day and were let out at noon. I met up with my buddy Zeke in the student lot and talked him into going to see Alejandra Aja's The Hills Have Eyes remake with me. It had just come out the same day, but because it was a weekday afternoon showing of a horror movie, we were surprised to find that particular theater almost completely empty. The one exception, aside from ourselves, was an elderly woman seated at the end of the row closest to the theater's entrance, so that we had to walk directly past her regardless of where we chose to sit. The woman must have heard us coming as we entered the hallway leading into the theater, because she was already staring at us as we rounded the corner, and I turned to scan the rows of vacant seats, inadvertently meeting her gaze in the process. She didn't look angry or even annoyed. The old woman didn't look like she was currently feeling anything. Her wrinkled face was completely void of emotion. I could tell by the uneasy glance we exchanged as we passed her that Zeke had been just as unnerved by the old woman as I had. "She's got to be in the wrong theater, right?" he whispered as we took our seats several rows behind the woman. I shrugged and quietly replied, "Maybe she's just a big fan of haute tension." I meant it as a joke, but Zeke seemed to be seriously considering the possibility. Now it was his turn to shrug as he slapped his seat's armrest and said, "Gotta go to the bathroom." I checked the time on my phone as Zeke stood and started back down the aisle. "You've got 3 minutes before the trailers start." Zeke nodded without looking at me, and then abruptly turned and retreated back to where we were seated, squeezing past me on his way to the aisle on the other side as he muttered, "I'm not walking by that dead-eyed woman again." As Zeke reached the far aisle and started towards the theater's rear exit, I turned my attention back to the old woman. My seat was closer to the theater's center. From that angle, I correctly assumed the old woman could see me in her peripheral vision, and so I waved. When she didn't seem to notice, I leaned over the seat in front of me to make myself even more obvious and waved again. "Ma'am? Excuse me, ma'am?" I stayed just like that for what felt like a good 30 seconds, half my body leaning over the seat in front of me and waving at the side of the woman's head. Finally, and oh so very slowly, the old lady turned to look, aiming her expressionless expression directly at me. I immediately regretted getting her to do so. The old woman's gaze felt like a weight hanging from me, like there was an actual density to it. Eventually I realized she was waiting for me to say something. I tried my best to force a polite smile as I said, "Do you like these kinds of movies?" The old woman slowly nodded her head. "You know what kind of movies I'm talking about?" Again, she nodded. "This is a horror movie, probably a pretty brutal one too. Are you sure you're in the right theater?" Finally, something vaguely resembling a human emotion flashed across the woman's weathered face as she narrowed her eyes at me. For the briefest of moments, she actually seemed frustrated. Then, just like that, the old woman's frustration was suddenly replaced by a look that can only really be described as snarky. Her lips pulled back to form a wide, primate grin, revealing what looked like several pieces of archaic dental brace fixed to her teeth as thick strings of drool began to leak from the corners of her mouth. I will put my hand on a stack of Bibles mixed in with a stack of Incredible Hulk number 180, First Appearance of Wolverine, and I will swear that not only is all of this true, but also those braces looked like they were completely covered in rust, like they had been there for decades. Coincidentally, that was the exact moment the theater's lights were dimmed until we were shrouded in complete darkness. I let out a yelp as I heard the needle pop crackle of the theater's sound system being switched on, prompting me to hop up out of my seat and book it out of there. And just like Zeke, I made sure to take the long way. I was so genuinely freaked out that I basically ran straight to the parking lot and then started freaking out even more when I couldn't find my car. Finally, I remembered that Zeke had driven us there in his car, and a pit instantly formed in my stomach as I realized he might have gone back into the theater by himself. I dug my cell phone from my pocket and called him, and that's when I heard his distinct ringtone emanating from his car, which was parked a few spaces over from where I was currently pacing. Zeke was in there too, rocking out to music. I yanked open the passenger door to hear Zeke already queuing up his apology, how he wasn't in the mood for something scary, but he doesn't mind waiting around until it's over. I could tell he was really out here because of the old woman. Zeke had always been very in tune when it came to these sort of things, but when I told him what happened after he left the theater, he immediately called BS. And I know it's BS because she followed me to the bathroom. What? No, dude, she didn't. I was right there the whole time. Well, she did because I saw her in the... He stopped short there and then just began crying. Eventually, the crying became sobbing, and I never got to hear what the end of his sentence would have been. Me and Zeke stopped hanging out not too long after. We even got into and attended the same college, but had completely different friend groups while we were there. A part of me knows that day was the reason for all of it. Thank you for joining, and please make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment.